Hello and welcome along to this week's Liverpool.com podcast. I'm your host again, Matt Addison, and once again, Tom Beattie is alongside me. We're going to talk a little bit about Bournemouth and a little bit about the transfer window as well. Partly about Liverpool and partly about one or two of their rivals too. But don't forget to get the best discount off your NordVPN plan. You can go to nordvpn.com/bloodred, and our link also gives you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. There's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, and the link with all of the information on that is in the podcast episode description box below. Let's get stuck into the transfer window, though, Tom. We'll start there. Obviously, wasn't hugely busy for Liverpool. As we record this, we're still waiting on confirmation that Jadon Danns is going to Sunderland, but that looks like that's going to go through on a loan for the rest of the season. One or two other little bits and pieces as well. We, throughout January, discussed a few different things that we might want Liverpool to do at some point, whether that was this month or in the summer, but I don't think it was ever particularly likely that Liverpool were going to be busy. How do you assess the January transfer window just from a Liverpool perspective to begin with? Are you at all surprised that they didn't make any signings, and do you think they're in a position in terms of the squad that Arne Slot has got that they didn't maybe need to in order to achieve their aims for the rest of this season?
Yeah, it's a bit of a strange one. Obviously, there's always that clamour, isn't there, for new signings, I think, whichever window that you're in. But I think that it's very difficult for a club of Liverpool's size and stature, just in terms of the squad that they've already got, in terms of kind of improving that. And sort of when you look at the options on the market, you know, you don't want it to be a case that, you know, you overspend on players that maybe don't improve your team long term. And I think there's always that long term vision, particularly under FSG and sort of the model that's there now, obviously with kind of the new recruitment team as well. So yeah, I think I wasn't overall surprised really that Liverpool didn't add anyone, and that interview came out with Arne Slot, didn't it, with Gary Lineker, where he basically admitted that, you know, more so they're looking at the summer window and sort of who they can bring in that time. And I think when you actually kind of sit there and digest that, I think it probably does make a bit more sense. I think given where Liverpool are in the table as well, certainly in the Premier League and also with the Champions League as well, how well they've done. I think, you know, it'd be very difficult to kind of displace people from the team at the moment. And I think at every kind of position, Liverpool are well stocked as well. So yeah, I think maybe there were always going to be names kind of bandied about, but I think overall it was probably the best decision to kind of move forward with what they already had and maybe look towards the summer, like the manager said, and maybe that is the time to sort of bring people in with a kind of fresh pre-season behind them and go again next season. But yeah, I think for January, kind of sitting tight with the options that Liverpool have got, it was probably the right decision.
Yeah, I think it was always the case that they would do something if the right thing came up. There was a bit of talk about Kvaratskhelia, wasn't there, when he went to PSG from Napoli at the start of the month, and you wondered maybe if Liverpool didn't already have 2 really good left wingers, maybe they could have got a little bit more involved in that, but you can kind of understand why that wasn't the case. I'm a big fan of the player. I think he's excellent, and I think he'll do really well for PSG, but you know, for Liverpool, was it one that they desperately needed? Absolutely not. And you know, we're not quite sure what is going to happen in terms of the forward options that they've got in the summer. And I think the Bournemouth game, I was down there over the weekend to watch Liverpool win there really well, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in the show. But you know, I was there, but Federico Chiesa and Joe Gomez weren't. They stayed back in Liverpool. I mean, that sort of sums it up, doesn't it, at the moment, in terms of the squad that they've got, the depth, the options that they've got. They don't necessarily need to add more players in terms of depth, because obviously at the moment everyone is fit. Trent obviously went off injured. We're not quite sure exactly what the results of his scan are going to be, but you know, in terms of pure numbers at the moment, if you're keeping Chiesa and Joe Gomez at home for a game as big as that, the idea that you desperately need to add 1 or 2 more players to the squad maybe just isn't the case, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, he's got a plethora of options, hasn't he, in them kind of attacking roles. And given Mo Salah that rest, obviously, for the European game, I think that paid dividends for the manager in the end. You know, he looked just on another level, didn't he, against Bournemouth, and those 2 goals were crucial and ultimately got Liverpool over the line in that game as well. So I think, it is positive in a way, like to say that, the likes of Federico Chiesa, we can play sort of in the midweek in what was essentially a dead rubber in the Champions League against PSV. He put in a decent performance, I felt, and he kind of showed promise of what he might be able to bring sort of moving forward throughout the second half of the season. But I think just being able to give a player like Mo Salah that rest, I think he looked rejuvenated, didn't he, at the weekend? And yeah, that's kind of what you need, I think, to be sustaining a charge over kind of 4 fronts, which is what I think Liverpool are aiming for this season. Just being able to kind of rotate your options is really important, and I think that has been one of the manager's real kind of plus points. Kind of first half of the season was that he was always able to rotate the squad really well, and you mentioned about obviously the Trent injury. We're not kind of sure on the ramifications of that as things stand, but yeah, just kind of having an option like Conor Bradley as well, ready and waiting, that kind of shows again the strength and depth that's already there for the manager. And I think, we spoke on a previous show about Liverpool potentially having the best squad in the world, and I think we are seeing the fruits of that, in games like the Bournemouth game. They were obviously in really good form coming into that match, and I think that, Liverpool knew what a kind of staying test it was, and I think that was shown in the lineup that Arne Slot went for in the European game through midweek as well. So, there were that many changes, wasn't there, for that game. So, yeah, I think that Liverpool showed them a lot of respect in the game, but, ultimately that quality was there, and maybe that rest and being able to, give people, that game off, I think that really did work in Liverpool's favour ultimately coming into the Bournemouth game.
Yeah, we'll come back to the Bournemouth game and another opportunity as well in the next couple of games in Tottenham and Plymouth in the 2 competitions for a little bit more rotation as well. We'll come back to that at the end of the show. But as well as Liverpool in the transfer window, I wanted to touch on a couple of their rivals as well. Obviously, Manchester City spent a lot of money. Arsenal as well, obviously the closest team to Liverpool. I think it's fair to say that most people expected them to sign an attacker. They did try and get Ollie Watkins. They looked at a couple of other players as well. But it's interesting that Mikel Arteta wasn't able to get that player over the line and wasn't able to do that, because I think it's been such a glaring issue for Arsenal this season. It's probably one that most people looked at during the summer and thought maybe they haven't quite got enough goals in them. But the fact that they didn't manage to do that, the fact that they did go and bid reportedly somewhere between 40 and 60 million for Watkins, seemingly without any real kind of knowledge or understanding that was definitely going to happen. Normally you kind of get the insurances that's going to happen first before you start putting in bids, but it didn't seem that was the case. Villa adamant that if John Duran went, that Ollie Watkins wasn't going to go. It's interesting that Arsenal went down that route and tried to do that. The fact that they haven't, I think, is possibly a very good thing for Liverpool for the rest of this season. But what did you make of Arsenal's transfer window, and particularly that bid for Watkins? I think it sums up, doesn't it, the big glaring issue and probably the difference really in this title race between the 2 top teams.
Yeah, I mean, it is a bit of an odd one, and it just kind of shows sort of how tricky a market it is in January, and, to kind of come out of that period and they still haven't added the attacking option. I think that does kind of show, the lack of options that are out there at the moment in terms of that kind of centre-forward position. And, yeah, I think you're right to say that, they are kind of lightly stocked in that area, and it does look like a glaring kind of part of the squad that does need improvement, I think, long term for Arsenal. And Kai Havertz at the weekend, he had a good game. He can obviously play that position, and Gabriel Jesus maybe coming off the bench, he is an option for them. But I think in terms of when you compare it with Liverpool, Liverpool are really well stocked. Diogo Jota, Luis Diaz has been playing as a centre forward, and obviously Darwin Núñez as well. So there is that contrast, and I think that has been shown overall so far this season. Liverpool have scored the most goals so far this season as well, haven't they, in the Premier League? And I think Arsenal have scored 7 less goals than Liverpool over the course of them 24 games that they have played. So there is that bit of a difference, I think, in terms of that attacking prowess that they're able to have it every single game, I think. And maybe that's been the advantage that Liverpool have had ultimately on Arsenal so far this season. There's not much in terms of that defensive kind of setup and, the results that both teams have been able to get in terms of that, defensively. So I think moving forward, I think that is an area that, Arsenal are going to have to look to strengthen. And I think if they're going to put together a major kind of title charge maybe next season. But yeah, I think the league's still kind of up for grabs for them, but I think it would have been a massive point in the season if they were able to get a deal over the line for Ollie Watkins. And they probably got a little bit unlucky, didn't they? That John Duran went out the door maybe a couple of days before to Saudi Arabia. So yeah, maybe that deal would have happened, maybe it wouldn't. But, it did show that they had that intent to maybe add an attacker. And I think possibly they'll kind of be disappointed, I think, to have emerged out of the transfer window without one.
Yeah, it's still a glaring weakness, even though it's a little bit harder to make that argument after they've just put 5 past Manchester City, which we'll talk about Manchester City as well. I mean, it's safe to say that they're not going to be a part of the title race. They face a bit of a battle, I think, with the likes of Bournemouth to get into the top 4 as well. But it's been really interesting. We just tallied up before we started recording how much money that they've spent, around 200 million in January with the players that they've brought in. But what have you made of them? It's interesting, isn't it? The approach that they've had. As I say, they're chasing the top 4 or maybe 5, might be enough to get into the Champions League next season if the Premier League gets the extra place. But it's interesting that they've gone big at a time when they probably need to do the same again in the summer. There's still, a couple of question marks over them. But what have you made of the players that they've brought in? Because they've spent a lot of money, but they're not necessarily sort of proven and necessarily ready to come in and make an impact straight away.
Yeah, I think it really does show where Man City are at the moment. And, they are kind of in a battle for top 4, like I say. I think the areas that they have strengthened in is kind of across the park, isn't it? And, Marmoush was a player who was mentioned on Liverpool's radar a little bit in the past. But, he's a player who they spent big on. And I think, that is a signing that I think will excite their fans. And I think he is a talented player. I think long term he might be a good replacement for the likes of, Mahrez and sort of Alvarez, that kind of top level attacker that I think they've been missing. Maybe even off the bench and sort of as a rotation option kind of moving forward. And, I'll be honest, the likes of Gonzalez and Kusanov, I think obviously they're untested, sort of in what you would kind of characterise as one of the sort of top leagues. Obviously they've been playing in France and Portugal. So I think maybe that transition to the Premier League, we'll see how they're going to do. I think it is interesting to kind of see them spending that big in January. It's not something that we see that often with teams, is it? And I think ultimately the aim now for them must be to get in that top 4. And we saw it kind of the second to last season under Jurgen Klopp, where Liverpool struggled, and they did miss out on that top 4 ultimately. And I think, given how it went for Man City in that first half of the season, I think if they were to get into that top 4, I think it kind of would be a bit of an achievement in itself. And obviously it's not been the kind of title defence that they would have wanted to have put up. But I think maybe it's a case of damage limitations now and possibly getting back in that Champions League for next season and building from the summer. And like I say, I do expect them to maybe, spend big again in the summer. But yeah, it's always a gamble ultimately when you do lay out that kind of money. And there's only so many times you can keep on doing that, particularly with sort of financial fair play rules and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think ultimately we're going to see whether them transfers work out, I think, in the second half of the season. And it is a massive outlay from them, but I think it is a massive kind of signal of intent as well. And I don't think they're going anywhere sort of overall. Obviously Haaland signed that 9-year deal, and I think Pep signed a long-term deal back in November, December kind of time as well. So I think long term, City are here to stay, and obviously they won so many titles in a row, didn't they? So yeah, I don't think they're going anywhere, but it is a big kind of signal of intent, I think, them signings that they have made in January.
Yeah, I wonder whether in terms of January, it's almost a bit like what Liverpool did maybe with Luis Diaz when they obviously had him and Sadio Mane for 6 months, and you can bed in those players in the second half of the season. It almost feels to me like it's probably not going to change that much for them between now and the summer. But then maybe if they can add a few more experienced players in the summer, the likes of Marmoush and Kusanov and Gonzalez can then have had 6 months to bed in. They'll then have a full pre-season. Maybe at the start of next season we start to see a bit more of the usual Manchester City again once they've managed to refresh a couple more areas as well. But I don't... Obviously, Liverpool play them away from home in a couple of weeks' time, and that's not going to be an easy game. But I think, generally speaking, between now and the end of the season, it'd just be a massive relief, I think, for them to get into the top four, and for them to be in that position, I think is a little bit of a strange feeling. People are a little bit reluctant to maybe say it. I think even up to now, people have been maybe reluctant from a Liverpool perspective to rule them out completely. But I think it's safe to say we are at that point, and I think damage limitation was the phrase that you used. I think that's a pretty accurate way of putting it really for the rest of this season. And as I mentioned before, it's a bit of a battle between them, Bournemouth, a couple of other teams to get into that top four as well. Nottingham Forest in there as well. Liverpool have played them away from home recently. But let's move on to the Bournemouth game. I want to touch upon them in a couple of different ways, really. But firstly, that was one of the trickiest games I think that Liverpool will play this season. The fact that they've gone there, they've won 2-0, they've scored a couple of really good goals and kept a clean sheet as well. It was a big win, wasn't it? How much of a statement performance do you think we might look upon that much at the end of this season?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of parallels maybe with sort of, those big victories in the title-winning season in times gone by. And it was such a kind of statement win, I felt. And obviously coming into the game, I think Bournemouth quite rightly had a kind of a big build-up, didn't they? They'd gone unbeaten, and I think the manager's doing sort of an incredible job down there as well. Sort of that style of play that they're playing, and I think they're playing with confidence as well. And you could see coming into the game, some of the options they've got. Justin Kluivert and Semenyo as well. They've been in great form, haven't they? And I think it was such a staying test for Liverpool, and I don't think we had it all our own way in the game as well. I think Liverpool had to really work for the victory, and there was times where I think Bournemouth were kind of peppering Liverpool's goal, and it looked like it could be a long afternoon for Liverpool. But I think ultimately that kind of level of class that the likes of Mo Salah has, and obviously Virgil van Dijk at the back, and even the goalkeeper as well, Addison, it's that kind of experience in games and that patience, I think. And I think that told over a long period in that game, really. And ultimately, the 2 goals from Liverpool, obviously one was a penalty, but that quality, I think, from Mo Salah, I think only him and a handful of players can kind of score that sort of goal. I think that's kind of his level of quality, and maybe that was the difference on the day. Obviously, I think maybe next season, Bournemouth will be playing European football, maybe even Champions League football, and that kind of shows the level of opponents I think that Liverpool came up against it at the weekend. But yeah, just kind of the quality across the park, I think told from Liverpool, and it looked a really kind of experienced performance from Liverpool. And I didn't have many doubts, I think, over sort of the 90 minutes that Liverpool would get the job done. And I think there were performances in there as well. Ryan Gravenberch, again, he's showing how important he is to this team. Cody Gakpo, I think, that done well before he came off, and that back four again was really settled, wasn't it? Obviously Trent, he had to come off in the game, and maybe that was kind of the one performance that maybe didn't go to plan. But I think just maybe having their options off the bench as well. Conor Bradley coming on, and he did well ultimately. So again, it's a squad game. Liverpool are showing sort of that strength and depth, I think, over the course of 90 minutes. And yeah, to come off the back of a tough European game, albeit with a lot of changes. But yeah, just to kind of come into a game like that against Bournemouth and look kind of comfortable and get the job done, I thought that was really impressive.
Yeah, they've got so many good players. I was particularly keen to watch Milos Kerkez, but I thought Dean Huyson alongside him was unbelievably good. Sabani as well was incredible, won everything in the air, really good on the ball. I looked him up during the game and didn't realise he was only 22. I think it's, a hugely, hugely impressive back line when you've got a 21-year-old, a 19-year-old, a 22-year-old, and then a midfielder filling in at right back. They were fantastic all the way across the board, really. That defence in particular I thought was really impressive. Further forward, you mentioned Antoine Semenyo. I thought he gave Trent a really tough time. There was a couple of moments where Trent looked, panicked a little bit, really, and there was one, I think it was early on, he headed the ball back across his own penalty area at one point because he just didn't quite know where Semenyo was and he didn't want to risk heading it down to his feet. It was him that I think hit the crossbar, wasn't it, with the shot at one stage as well. I mean, they've got so many good players. There's a couple of ways I want to go with this. Firstly, they've got so many players because of Richard Hughes, who's now at Liverpool, which I think is interesting. In terms of him, there's been a lot of discussion, certainly on social media, of what he has or hasn't done. But there was an excellent piece in the Times. If people haven't read it, they definitely should, from Jonathan Northcroft, who sort of detailed it a little bit about that. And Liverpool haven't been active in the transfer market, but I think there are mitigations in terms of why that is, as we discussed at the start of the podcast. But just watching that game, I don't know about you, Tom, but it just sort of made me realise really quite how good the job was that Richard Hughes did. And clearly Liverpool ahead of the curve again. They probably didn't think that Bournemouth would be getting into the Champions League this season, but definitely Michael Edwards or someone behind the scenes has seen what Richard Hughes has done, because that Bournemouth team is essentially his. Andoni Iraola was his pick. It's just a really, really well-run football club. And I think that probably points to a bright future for him at Liverpool as well, even though we maybe haven't quite seen the full extent of that just yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I was thinking that during the game as well. And like you say, I think there has been, a lot of debate over sort of the job he's done in the short time he's been at Anfield. But yeah, you look across the park there for Bournemouth and the amount of players that were his signings who really excelled in the game, and they've excelled over the course of the season, haven't they? The likes of Kerkez, Hyson, Kluivert, Semenyo, Utara as well, who led the line. I think he came in sort of as a winger and a wing back, and now he's playing as a centre forward. And maybe having that eye for a player, we haven't been able to see as much of that so far in his time at Anfield. Only one kind of senior signing so far. But yeah, I think, over the course of his time at Liverpool, I think we're going to see sort of the fruits of bringing in someone like that, and being able to identify a manager like Iraola as well. I think there's going to be a lot of suitors for him, when big jobs do ultimately come up, and, they might have a job on their hands kind of keeping him. And if they do get in the Champions League, it is an achievement, isn't it? A major achievement for a club of Bournemouth size, with all due respect. And we've seen that with a few clubs, haven't we, in recent times? Obviously, Forest are riding high. Obviously, they've got a great history, but, maybe they've done it a different way. They spent a lot of money, brought a lot of players in. But I think Bournemouth have been really calculated with kind of that sort of data approach. And ultimately, I think that's why Liverpool looked at Richard Hughes and why he's been brought in. And I think, it does look a really astute pick, doesn't it, in terms of that sporting director role now. And yeah, I'm kind of excited now to see what he's going to do in the summer. I think there will be more signings, obviously, in the summer. We have kind of identified on the show before today a couple of areas that Liverpool can be looking at. And I wouldn't be surprised maybe if he did go in for Kerkez at left back. I think he really impressed in the game, like you said. And yeah, that might be an option for Liverpool moving forward. And I think if Liverpool weren't as kind of well stocked in sort of that left wing position, maybe, a couple of players that they've got there, Liverpool will be looking at as well. I think Kluivert on the day, he did miss a couple of chances, but he looked bright, didn't he? And, he's been in a really good run of form. So, I think he's a player who might get a move to a Champions League club, I think maybe next season. And that's kind of where you feel for Bournemouth a little bit, isn't it? Where, some of them players might ultimately get picked off by sort of them bigger clubs, maybe in the summer and moving forward. But yeah, I think it is credit to Richard Hughes, kind of the job that he did there, that, you look at how well they're doing. And if they do get into the Champions League, I think it will be one of the big kind of stories in recent kind of Premier League history that they've been able to do that. You look at kind of the size of the ground and sort of the stature of the club. it wasn't something that many of us would have expected coming into this season. So, yeah, I think they're really doing well, and it looks like a club on the up as well.
Yeah, you mentioned Milos Kerkez there. I wanted to talk about him as well. Obviously, we've mentioned quite a few times about that left-back position. I actually thought it was Andy Robertson's best game of the season, probably by quite a distance, to be honest. He didn't do a great deal going forwards, but defensively very solid and sat in and did the job diligently, really. Didn't really make too many mistakes across the course of the 90 minutes, which I think is definitely a big positive. But that doesn't change the fact that longer term Liverpool are going to have to think about that. And Kerkez just so impressive. He's a lot more physical than I realised he was. He's certainly very quick. He's obviously made a big difference. And I think it was really interesting that afterwards Arne Slot said that he'd moved Ryan Gravenberch's position to help out in terms of that side of the pitch. Now, partly that is obviously about Antoine Semenyo as well, and possibly a little bit about Trent maybe being much better going forwards than he is defensively. But I think Kerkez comes into that as well. He looked like a player that you could see fitting into the way that Liverpool play. I think he almost looked a little bit like what Andy Robertson looked like 4 or 5 years ago, where he's got that engine where he can run up and down the pitch. He can, obviously produce a lot of quality in terms of the final third, the final ball. I think it was only a couple of weeks ago that he scored the excellent goal. I think it was against Newcastle, where he gets forward and finds the final touch to get the ball into the back of the net there. So, yeah, what have you made of Kerkez, not just in this game, but across the course of the season? And yeah, do you think he is an option, having seen him? Is he the one that you'd pick? If you could pick any Bournemouth player, would it be Milos Kerkez in the summer? How impressed were you with him?
I was really impressed with him, and like I say, a bit more physical than what I expected. But we look at the players he came up against in that game, and sort of come up against a player like Mo Salah as well with his pace, kind of over them 5 or 10 yards as well. I think you kind of need that bit of physicality, and yeah, like you say, the way shades of Andy Robertson kind of in there, and that's always been an attribute of his game that I've always loved. So yeah, I think maybe looking at the summer, he is a player I think that Liverpool maybe should be looking at having on the shortlist. And I think the other ones, maybe Anthony Robinson at Fulham, but I think maybe just because of Kerkez's age, I think he maybe fits the bill more so for me. And yeah, I was just really impressed with them. And I think the comments from Arne Slot as well around the game were really telling and really interesting. We did kind of praise him, didn't he? And obviously you mentioned as well about maybe tweaking kind of his tactical setup as well, given how well he was doing in the game. And I think the comments as well that he made, he did kind of earmark, again, the role that Richard Hughes had to play in signing him as well. So you kind of see the respect that, was there for him as kind of a sporting director as well, in terms of Arne Slot. And I wouldn't be surprised, I think, if Liverpool went in for Kerkez ultimately, given that connection. And obviously, again, I'm not privy to any information on that, but I think that it would kind of make a lot of sense, wouldn't it? And yeah, I think if Liverpool are to look to improve in that position, maybe to move on the likes of, Tsimikas, maybe it would make a lot of sense to go in for Kerkez. We don't know how Liverpool are going to play that ultimately, but I think, yeah, it will kind of add up, wouldn't it? That, he will be a player that I think will fit the bill, and, possibly to come in, not as an understudy to Robertson, but maybe to kind of share that role next season. I think would make a lot of sense for Liverpool moving forward.
Yeah, there's not too many areas where you can say, you can upgrade this Liverpool squad, but I think if Kerkez did come in, that would be probably, it's fair to say, a fairly substantial upgrade on what we've seen from Andy Robertson this season. So that's definitely something that I'd be looking out for. And obviously with the Richard Hughes link as well, you'd like to think that was possibly one that might be slightly easier maybe to do than maybe one or two other deals. But obviously lots of moving parts heading into the summer, not least the 3 contracts that Hughes has got to sort out as well. So there's still lots of things to do for him, and obviously appreciate that. But there's still plenty of reasons for positivity as well, I'm sure. But I think that'll just about bring us to the end of today's show. We've not had time to dive into Spurs and Plymouth. Obviously 2 cup games coming up for Liverpool this week, but I'm sure on next week's show we'll touch on them. It's obviously the Merseyside derby next week as well, so plenty of stuff for us to get into, and I'm sure transfers, I know people do love us talking about transfers, and we have across the course of this month done that plenty of times. I'm sure we'll do that plenty of times before the summer as well. But yeah, I think, as I say, that will do us for this week's show. Thank you to Tom for joining me. Thank you to you at home as well for watching and listening. We'll catch you next week on the Liverpool.com podcast.